All right, guys, welcome back to the podcast. We are going to go over warming up today. So, this is something that I think a lot of people kind of understand, but to be honest, I think that a lot of people's experience with warming up happens through learning like how to warm up a class. And we can be a little bit more specific and targeted with our warm ups if you're a competitive athlete and you've got, a full day of training coming towards you. So, generally the first spot that you want to start for determining what you're going to warm up, how you're going to warm up, is to see which movement patterns are present in that day of training. And so the way I kind of look at it and break things down are we've got squatting, bending, or hinging, we've got pushing and pulling, core and hip flexion, and then stepping, lunging, and jumping and running. So core and hip flexion would be the things like toes to bar. Ski, for example, is another one. Rope climbs, all those things have some, amount of core and hip flexion, oftentimes paired with pulling. Stepping and lunging, I would include like a box step up with this or sled. So there's a little bit, more than just lunging, but oftentimes in CrossFit, it is just showing up as a lunge, especially in competition. And then jumping and running, I added in there. So those would often be considered cyclical movements, but I think that doing things like double unders, box jumps, and running with the lower leg involves a little bit more warm up potentially, or at least some considerations if we've got, nagging injuries and stuff. So I put them in there as a separate category. So once we've identified the pattern that is going to be present in your training day, we want to look at the joints and the tissues involved with that movement pattern. And so this is not an extensive list of the tissues and joints involved because there's a lot more to it than how I kind of, what I reduced it down to here. But in general, for the squat, we're looking at using the hip, knee, and ankle joint. Those are the three kind of main joint systems involved with squatting. You could argue that like shoulder and lat a little bit if it's got to do with like front squatting or overhead squatting, but by and large with squats, every squat is going to have some level of hip, knee, and ankle movement, and the tissues that are going to be used to execute the squat would be quads, hamstrings, glutes, and erectors. For bending or hinging, we've got to bend the hip, the knee, and then sometimes the ankle. It depends on the angle of the bending and what that bending looks like. So you could imagine that for a Romanian deadlift, the angle of the ankle doesn't really change that much. But if you are doing like a trap bar deadlift, for example, there is a little bit more foot flexion going on there. The tissues involved with bending are going to be hamstrings, quads, glutes, erectors, oftentimes lats and upper back, just so that you can hold on to the implement and like execute the hinge. But you could see that like if you were going to do a body weight GHD hip extension, then you would not be using the lats and the upper back quite as much, if at all. For pushing, generally we're using the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist. So the shoulder, it should be obvious, and same with the elbow, we've got to extend the elbow. But wrist, oftentimes I find that when people have wrist injuries, pushing movements are one of the things that become more challenging for them. So I put that in there as an extension of that. The primary tissues that are going to be used are the chest, delts, triceps, and then traps, depending on the angle of which you were pressing. For the pull, we're looking at shoulder, elbow, and then sometimes the wrist. I would argue that a lot of times people, when they have wrist injuries, the hanging doesn't tend to be as challenging for them as pressing, usually because the load is pulling the joint space open a little bit as opposed to closing it off and causing some form of like stability or flexion or extension of the wrist. The upper back, lats, and biceps and forearms are going to be the primary muscle groups involved in those. There is also, I should note, on pushing movements, some use of the forearms to help stabilize the weight, but since you're having to hold on to the implement to pull the implement up, the weight, or pull down on the pull-up bar, there is a more grip involved. For core and hip flexion, primarily just the hip, and we're looking at hip flexors, quads, and the anterior core as the muscle groups that execute that movement. As I mentioned earlier, oftentimes that core and hip flexion movement is also involved with some form of pulling in the form of like a rope climb, toes to bar, that sort of thing. But if you simplify it to something like a GHD sit-up or a V-up, the hip flexors, quads, and anterior core are the primary drivers for that, and there is no upper body component other than the anterior core. For stepping and lunging, we're moving through the hip, knee, and ankle, and then the quads, glutes, hamstrings, and hip flexors are the primary muscle groups that are involved. The hip flexors, I think, is important to note there because if we're doing walking lunges, there's often some form of like assistance from the back leg pressing into the ground, and that drives force through the quad and the hip flexor, especially depending on what your stride length and how upright you are. And then for jumping and running, it's mostly the ankle and the knee, and then we've got like foot, calf, anterior tib, quads, and glutes that are involved with running and jumping. But primarily, the things that need to be warmed up are the smaller muscle groups, like in the calves, the anterior tib, and then some stuff in the feet. So now that we've identified those things, you can notice that a lot of the movements have a lot of overlap, right? And so it's not like we have to warm up the squat, then go warm up the bending movement, then go warm up the hip flexion movement and the stepping movement, right? So if we've got like a lower body day, quads, hamstrings, and glutes are being used in the squat, the bend, the hip flexion, and in the stepping and lunging, right? Specifically the quads. And other like secondary movements are like the erectors and the hip flexors, which also have quite a bit of overlap, right? And so once you've identified what movement patterns and joints are being used and the tissues involved in executing the movement, you can look for overlap and then go and adjust like where you're going to focus your time in the warm-up depending on how frequent that muscle group and joint system is present, right? So in this instance, I would spend a good amount of time warming up my quads, probably my glutes and my hamstrings, and maybe not quite as much time warming up like my hip flexors or my upper back or my lats, right? Whereas if I, was going to do some form of like toes to bar or something like that, I might spend more time working on my hip flexors and my lats and my upper back, right? So once we have identified that, we want to warm up those specific muscle groups, and we want to spend more time on larger tissues and bigger joint systems. So they tend to take a little bit longer to get warmed up and to mobilize those joints. And in addition to that, we want to spend more time on previous problem areas. So if we've got a history of, getting back pain or something like that and we're doing a lower body day, but we want to spend a good amount of time working on probably the glutes and the lower back to make sure that everything's warm and activated. And it also gives you a chance to kind of feel out the movement and see if you need to make any modifications to your training that day before you just get into it. So in terms of structuring your warm-up, once you've identified like what you kind of need to be warming up, the general flow that I like to follow is starting with some form of cardio. I find that this just kind of helps me get in the groove. It kind of gets some blood flow going. If you're sore at all, then this tends to kind of start to flush the system out a little bit and warm you up, make you feel better. Especially in the winter, if it's cold, this can be helpful for like getting things moving. I know that especially as you get older, it takes longer to kind of get the joints warm and lubricated and stuff. And so doing this cardio early on is a good way to kind of just like warm the whole system up. From there, usually what I'll do is I'll look at the joint systems involved and I'll do some mobilizations and stretching for those. For the stretching, I like to keep it dynamic. You don't want to stretch for too long. I think that's pretty common knowledge now. The reason for that is if you stretch for too long, it effectively desensitizes the spindle fibers in the muscle, which are fibers responsible for stretch shortening. Basically, you won't feel as dynamic and explosive, especially at the end range of motion for certain movements. And so I like to move in and out of those positions and kind of flow through the positions, but not necessarily spend a lot of static time in one. All right. From there, I'll usually do some small muscle activation, stability stuff. This is like using bands to kind of get the shoulders warmed up, or throwing a band around the ankles and doing some walks and stuff to warm up the hips. After that, then I'll pick movements that are the similar movement pattern, but not necessarily the same movement. Oftentimes, I like to pick unilateral movements, partial ranges of motion, and plyometrics, and use this like non-specific type of warm-up to kind of get the muscle groups primed and ready. And then from there, I'll do a specific build for that movement or the thing that's coming in that training day. If you're lifting, then that's when I would go into to begin your lift. If you're doing conditioning as your first thing, or like a tough mixed piece, then you want to continue on and do some sort of system prep. And when I do this, I'm looking at what energy system is being used. I want to make sure that it's on, right? And so if there's a highly anaerobic workout coming, it is important that we kind of turn that anaerobic system on and get all those metabolic processes up and running. Generally, shorter, more intense workouts require a little bit more warm up and system prep. In this instance, I like to use intervals. So I'll, do some intervals at like increasing intensity up to about race pace, but for like a very short amount of time, just to get everything up and running. For longer workouts, that's not quite as important. If we're going into a workout that's relatively long, or if it's like a bigger set of intervals, for those types of trainings, it is not as necessary that you like fully prep the system and are doing like tough bike sprints before you even go to do, Fran or whatever. Especially if you have a lot of intervals, you can kind of build throughout the intervals. If you start and you're like, I think I got a little bit more, there's nothing wrong with tacking another interval on at the end of your training anyways, right? And so generally longer workouts, like a high amount of intervals, usually you don't need to do as much like intense prep, but you still want to make sure that you're like sweaty and kind of the system's warm. All of the weights and the gymnastics and everything that are present in the workout have been, touched and done before you actually get started. So a quick overview is, I do some cardio to get the blood flowing. I identify the joint system and the tissues used in the training day that's coming. I'm going to stretch and mobilize those joint systems and the tissues. I'm going to do a little bit of stability work. Maybe this is where you throw in some prehab. This is where I touch on things that I know are problem areas for me. Wake everything up in the small muscles and kind of do some supportive work. From there, I'll move into like a non-specific version of the movement pattern and also add in some plyos depending on what is coming. And then I'll do, a specific movement build. So at this point, let's say I'm squatting, I'm starting to do some back squats at this point, right? If I'm going into a mixed piece that's pretty intense, or just a mixed piece in general, I'm going to prep the metabolic system. I'm not going to go straight into training after I finish this type of prep. I will continue on if it's really intense. I do a lot of like kind of ramps and builds up to the intensity that's going to be present in the training. If it's not quite as intense, if it's longer, if there's more intervals, then I'll kind of just get the system warm, make sure I have touched everything that's present in the workout, and then kind of get going from there. So as an example, let's say the training day has squats, Romanian deadlifts, and lunges. I'll bike for 3 to 5 minutes, 2 minutes of like an ankle dorsiflexion thing to get the ankles warmed up for the squatting, banded dynamic anterior hip stretch, so a band that's distracting the hip forward and pulling my hip flexor into extension. And maybe I'm like shifting my weight around and kind of like moving my hip in circles to kind of open up some ranges of motion there. And then maybe some 90-90 shin box switches. There's other options too here. You could do like a dynamic pigeon stretch. You could do a dynamic like hamstring stretch. It depends on where your mobility limitations and like what you typically struggle with are. That's like kind of where you're going to target that. Then I'll go into like something like this, 2 sets monster walk. Forward, backwards, side to side with the band around my knees or my ankles. Glute airplanes I really like for warming up the hips and the adductors. And then pull-up step downs, like get the quads warm. Like the 2 glute airplane and the pull-up step down are both unilateral movements. So I'm getting a little bit of stability in there. I'm prepping the quads, I'm prepping the hamstrings, prepping the hip and the adductors. Like a good amount of the things that are going to show up in my training are being touched there, right? And then here's an example of like this non-specific thing. I know I've got squats, RDLs, and lunges coming up in my training. I might do like 10 alternating reverse lunges, B stance deadlifts, and then box jumps to a moderate to tough height, right? And so you can see how there I am not doing necessarily the exact thing that's in my training, but it's something similar. And it's kind of helping me feel out how the body's feeling. And that plyo there like serves to really get me like, up and running. I can, get the type 2 fibers turned on and get real explosive there. All right. And then at that point, I'll just start working up to my squat weight, right? Like load the bar up, get it in the rack, and then start squatting. Okay. That's all I got for you today. I wanted to keep this one shorter. I keep trying to get them short, but they're like just like a little bit long. So I'm trying to keep it palatable for you, but yeah. Let me know if you have any questions. Emails up on the screen. Follow me on Instagram. If you like, comment, subscribe on this. It helps me out a lot. Hope you all have a good training. Hope this was helpful.